Okay, so following my success with repairing the Telefunken Salzburg 2 for a customer, he promptly handed me this late 30s Packard Bell to get back in functional condition, which is really not going to be hard as radios go. However, this is a 48E, I believe, and it's got some pretty severe cabinet damage, at least on the top, and there's a chip on the lower right side that I might be able to deal with. The problem is, I think this was stored in a fairly non-temperature controlled environment, probably a garage or something for most of his life, and it's starting to peel all the way down to the plywood base layer. Now my hope is, because this is actually several sheets stacked on top of each other, if I can maybe soak and heat off the original veneer, I might get lucky and have enough substrate and enough of this curved surface here to lay new stuff over, maybe sand it a little bit, because this is all, remember right, really this is all just basic walnut. Now the rest of the cabinet's actually in pretty good shape. The original labels are on the front and everything, they're not scratched. There's no other major gouges or problems with the finish, although the escutcheon and the two little escutcheon assemblies on the other side of this are completely and utterly warped. I think they might have been made out of tennite. Either that or Catalin, but most likely tennite. And the original plastic film that went over the front of the dial is yellowed and completely bowed out, snapped away. This, I just hate saying this because there's really nothing you can do in case of that besides finding a matching unit to gut. But every other model of Packard Bell, just like this one I've seen, has this exact same problem. It's like those Stromberg Carlson sets that have the shrinking escutcheon that just sort of pulls in at all the edges and leaves a gap whenever you screw it back on. Now the bottom ones for the automatic tuning, I'll get to that in a second, are in pretty decent condition. They're warped, but they still fit. But I really wanted to try and get this in good condition. I'm thinking, because if I can clean it up enough, I may remove this and try putting a piece of small clear acrylic sheet in place. I don't think that'll work quite as well. Maybe I could find a very thin material to try and form in there to hold in place. So I could make it look halfway decent, but I don't think that'll work. Now, as far as the radio goes, it's been serviced in the past. All the electrolytics were replaced. I want to say about maybe late 70s, early 80s-ish, based on the parts used. They did use looks like polypropylene capacitors on the other side, 600 volt limits, although they did use one of those normal ones instead of a safety cap on the line to chassis ground, so I'll swap that out. And I'll replace the other time-sensitive parts. The big issue, though, is that mice got to it, and fortunately due to lighting, you can barely see, but over on this side especially, a lot of debris. In fact, I sanitized the whole inside of the cabinet with WD-409 for quite some time to try and get all the discoloration and crap out of it. And the next step is going to be trying to clean all the crap off the surface of the chassis here, pulling all the tubes, and then I'm going to do the same routine that I'm doing on this oscilloscope that I've got in several pieces, which is to strip all the metal parts of rust and however fashion I feel like, usually with wire brushes, some chemical solution, that sort of thing, and then repaint it chassis silver. Now, unlike the oscilloscope, the radio does not seem to have quite so many topside ground connections. There might be a few for the antenna coils here, but it looks like Packard Bell went with a whole bunch of wiring through it, especially for the I-tube. The only thing that might be a problem is the connections for that. There's either a patter or a trimmer capacitor down there. It might be for tracking or something. The tuner assembly, though, appears to be on 4 rubber grommets, so for easy removal, which is nice because the whole dial assembly is actually a separate metal piece screwed onto the rest of the chassis, so that's good. Now, the tuning is actually the interesting part. I mean, it's your typical, you know, 2-3 part condenser tuning, and there's nothing super special there. But it's the push buttons that are really quite interesting. I'm used to seeing the mechanical systems on Zeniths and other things where it's basically just a whole bunch of coils being switched out in a tank circuit. But in this case, you're actually rotating the tuning shaft, and instead of doing it like how Airline did it, where they had a whole bunch of metal discs mounted on the shaft, and each button would lift a lever, and rotating the like a half moon shaped disc just enough to line it up the condenser with the right station. These actually have some sort of small fabric, almost like a shoestring, that's pinned to one end of this finger, I guess you could call it, and then the other end is wrapped several times around the tuning shaft, so that when you press it out, it unfurls and spins the shaft to the right spot on the dial. Hopefully, I'd imagine Fabric Flex is probably a bit of an issue with that. Now, I can't really, I've tried looking at it to see how it would work, and honestly, none of these do anything anymore. And I really don't know how you would even adjust these, because you had to be able to set them to the stations you wanted, and most of these are actually pinned in place. So my only guess is, and then I can see that there's some threading going on here, so I imagine this would be some sort of a length adjustment to get them to work, or some sort of clamp that you can adjust. But it's pretty rusty in there, so if I can salvage that and get it working, that would be great. But if I can't, the owner's not super worried about that. I would like, however, to replace both of the 6v6 GTAs with proper 6v6Gs. I know where some are. I'll have to replace the 6AF6 tuning eye, because that is completely dead. All the phosphorus is gone. I do like the little window they added right in front of it. And I also like the tone and the bass and treble controls that this has. Looking at the schematic, it's pretty simple. This set also has a television connection on the back for an audio input, so this set will actually be very nice to connect to an external audio source if desired. And I think the only really difficult thing is going to be disconnecting the speaker, which is really not supported by much on this set. I'm quite surprised. I think there's maybe 2 screws underneath there holding this on, and that's quite a large for an electrodynamic. I mean, you're pretty tiny space there, but since it would normally be sitting up against the grill, I could see why they didn't want to go with much. Overall, though, it's not in superbly bad condition. It's just nasty. And nasty is something that I can fix. So, once I get the other parts of the oscilloscope out of the way and make some more space on my bench, we'll get the Packard Bell seated up there and start stripping it down.
Alright, so after getting everything off the chassis, everything except the intermediate frequency cans, actually, I decided to leave the IFs in place and just tape over them because they were easy to clean up and polish a little bit. The entire chassis was gone over with wire wheel. I think that's all I used was a wire wheel, because at the end of the day, it wasn't a lot of heavy surface pitting. It was predominantly mouse pee and debris stuck to this thing. So once I got all of that off, and then I went over it with like denatured alcohol to clean up the remainder and get all the residue off, I taped absolutely everything on the chassis and then hit it with Rust-Oleum rust converting primer, followed up by some aluminum paint. And the only problem I have with the aluminum paint is it doesn't tend to dry really nicely, so I had to cover that with clear coat to get it to seal. The next trick was getting the tuning assembly fixed. I finally figured out how it worked, so the first thing after I pulled that out of there was I dipped it in vinegar to get all the rust off, which meant flipping it upside down and everything a few times, but it actually came out quite clean. The fabric straps, when you press one of the buttons in, it rolls it out a little bit, and you have to untwist the knob at the front, tune the dial to where you want, find your station, shove it in, and then tighten it while it's shoved in, and that will set how much of the fabric you want to be unrolled. And you should be able to have enough fabric to go from one end of the dial to the other on each one, so they all have identical lengths. The real trick was reproducing that, so I had to punch all of the eyelets out of the shaft in order to get to that part. Once I had them out, though, I was lucky in that one half the mice had actually chewed up one side and left the other relatively intact because it was trapped underneath some sheet metal. And I was able to take one piece that broke clean in half, and I got some fabric material from Joanne. I think it was Michaels, and I trimmed it to the same width. I used my soldering iron to melt the fraying bits on the one edge so that it wouldn't unravel. And then I used a leather punch set to create the new holes in the same positions and the same diameter. And then I also gently melted the inside edges of those to keep them from fraying. And I did this for all 6 segments. And it actually turned out pretty darn well. The next big hurdle was the damage to the top of the set. I was actually wrong with my initial assumption that they had used veneer throughout the entire thing. In fact, the top was one solid piece of material with the edges done in a sort of accordion style that allowed them to roll over the top. It's about a 1/4 inch thick all the way through. So what I wound up doing was using a saw and gently scoring the one large rectangular section that was damaged up to the curved edges and basically obliterating it. I hacked it out, drilled it, chopped it, any other way to get it out of there. And then I decided to build up in place with starting with a piece of plywood to give myself a good base, and with enough of a gap at the top to put in a new layer of walnut veneer. I had a roll with me that was a decent match to the material they use, a little bit different in color. The results of which I was actually pretty happy with. My only trouble was getting it where it matched up to the edges totally flat. Caused the veneer to get a little bit thin when I did the sanding, and I tried a number of different ways to blend it, blending pencils. I tried a little bit of wood filler to try and finish in the gaps and everything. Someone had previously free-finished the set, but they did it very quickly. And they'd also put on some gold foil labels on the controls, and the Packard Bells never had any of those. So when I cleaned the outside of the cabinet with lacquer thinner and all that, I got rid of everything. And I also made sure to repair the damage at the bottom with a new piece of veneer. I also cut, there's some thin stripes that go all the way around the cabinet, and I cut a new one in there and then filled those in with black paint before applying new semi-gloss lacquer over the entire thing. And this was one of the other main issues. This was the remains of the original Tenite escutcheon. This thing was messed up. Now I have a number of sets of Tenite escutcheons, but this is the only one that I've dealt with that it's actually started to break. It snapped clean in the middle, and so what I started doing was hitting it with a heat gun and then clamping each edge to a nice square block of wood in an attempt to get it to hold its shape again. I had some success, but the Tenite tended to just flex right back to where it went regardless of how long I heated it. So it was an effort in futility, but I got a little bit of straightness out of it. There's our before and afters. Now, the chassis was pretty nasty when I started, so I was really happy with the cleanup. One thing I will point out, though, the original dial lamp on this set does not actually have a holder. Instead, there's a piece of wire wrapped around it, and the bulb is physically soldered at both ends to the chassis. So it is not removable in any sense of the word. So I got rid of the dead bulb that was in it and soldered in a standard screw type socket in place so that in the future it's a lot easier, and it fits snugly into the original ring that was holding the bulb in the first place. Although honestly I would have preferred if Packard Bell had opted to put a matching bulb on the opposite side so that you'd have even illumination, because they're just trying to shine it into the end of the glass in order to get it to fill the entirety of the dial. Now the tuning eye, I also sourced a new old stock version of that, and I got a replacement plastic for the Tenite escutcheon and glued that in. And here we've got the front of the chassis all lit up and clean, and it really is quite stunning, I think. The speaker cone also got a few repairs. There were some tears on it, so I went in there with some washed out dryer sheet and rubber cement and carefully patched all the torn sections. I did also need to repair one of the strings for the tone control. Originally it was I forget exactly how it was attached, but they cheaply wrapped it around and put some glue on it, and it broke partway through the rebuild. So I had to figure out the length from the pre-existing Tone Control 1, copy it with some new material, and then try to reattach it the way it was originally done. And that turned out okay, but the tone controls on this set aren't anything really to they're not all that great. It's nothing compared to the ones on the Telefunken I'd done previously. These are very, very basic. And then of course we have what was the top of the chassis with all the tubes removed. I never did get around to replacing the two power output audio output tubes with more appropriate G-style versions. Since it already had a pair of GTs that were both good, I just left them in there because he just wanted this set to play, and it was more me being silly with wanting to get everything correct. I did source some proper metal tubes to replace one or two of the ones that were not glass, mostly because originally they would have had a grounding point for those tubes to reduce interference from outside sources. Here we have the top of the chassis, all nice and clean. Before I put the clear coat on, it was actually a lot more aluminum colored. The clear coat toned it down quite a bit, but really I was more than happy with how it came out. I wasn't really able to get the paint on the speaker done up well because the speaker is the only part that still had a Packard Bell paint label on the back of it, and I didn't want to get rid of that. So I sprayed the transformer black, cleaned up all the connections. I went through and gave it an RF and IF alignment so that the tracking was okay and that it peaks out well. And I actually installed an auxiliary jack on the back with an MP3, so when you flip it to the TV section, you can pass audio through it quite easily. And it amplifies very, very well, especially considering it has push-pull output. It can fill a room pretty nicely.
Townhall.com. I'm Chuck McDowell, CEO of Wesley Financial Group and timeshare cancellation advocate. I was lied to about. The jury size
is writer than you. Program writer than you.
Place the medicines of hypercortisone formulas to fight
TNF.
This is Freddie and Fitzsimmons on ESPN Radio, the ESPN app, and Sirius XM Channel 80. We are presented by Progressive Insurance. I'm Ian Fitzsimmons. Jeff Dickerson, my good friend, is in.
Says he wants this action to send a message.
Smart, comprehensive gun safety laws do much more to improve our communities, keep them free of gun violence than the guns on every street corner thinking of the gun lobby.
New Jersey law already.
Data from Shiite Houthi rebels. The deaths of the first casualties to be confirmed by coalition forces since launching the assault against Hodeidah early Wednesday. News and analysis at